Call an ambulance, now." The voice cut through the heavy air just seconds after Emily Carter's knees buckled beneath her, her body giving out against the unforgiving heat as she collapsed beside the shimmering blue pool, the concrete beneath her radiating like a stovetop left burning under the relentless 100-degree sun, her vision blurring as laughter and music continued around her like nothing had happened. Sunglasses shielding indifferent eyes while someone nearby muttered that she was probably just being dramatic. A phone camera lifting casually as if her struggle was just another moment worth capturing. But the voice came again, sharper this time, commanding, urgent, impossible to ignore, and suddenly the atmosphere shifted, though not fast enough to undo what had already happened, because just 3 hours earlier Emily had been standing in the exact same spot, forcing a smile as she adjusted a lounge chair for a guest who barely acknowledged her, her uniform already clinging to her back from the heat. Her throat dry despite sneaking sips of water whenever she could, knowing she wasn't supposed to take breaks unless told, knowing complaints meant risking the only job she had left after bills had piled up back home, her manager's voice echoing in her head from earlier that morning reminding everyone that the resort was at full capacity and no one was to slack off. Not today of all days, not with high-profile guests arriving. And Emily had nodded along like everyone else, even though she felt the warning signs creeping in, the slight dizziness, the heaviness in her limbs, the way the sunlight felt sharper than usual. But she ignored it because she had no choice, because missing a shift wasn't just losing hours, it was risking everything. So she kept moving, carrying trays, wiping chairs, answering demands that came faster than she could keep up, each step a little slower than the last, each breath a little more shallow, until even the sound of water splashing nearby felt distant, like it belonged to another world she couldn't quite reach anymore. And when she finally stumbled, when her hand missed the edge of a table and her balance slipped away completely, no one noticed at first, not really, because to them she was just part of the background, just another worker blending into the scenery, until she hit the ground and didn't get back up. And that's when the voice broke through everything, cutting across the music, the chatter, the careless indifference, carrying something different, something that didn't belong in this place of luxury and distraction, something real. And as Emily lay there, her world fading in and out, she had no idea that the man pushing through the crowd toward her wasn't just another guest, and that what he was about to do next would change far more than just this moment. The man dropped to his knees beside Emily without hesitation, ignoring the confused looks around him as he gently lifted her head, his voice steady but urgent as he called her name, even though he did not know it yet, his eyes scanning her face for any response while the heat pressed down like a weight on everyone nearby. And for the first time, the laughter around the pool began to fade into uneasy silence, because something about the way he moved did not match the casual indifference of the crowd. He was focused, controlled, and completely unafraid to take charge. He reached for a nearby towel, placing it under her head to shield her from the burning concrete, then looked up sharply at the staff who had frozen in place, his tone cutting through their hesitation as he demanded water, shade, and immediate help. And this time people moved, not because they suddenly cared, but because something in his voice made it clear they should have been paying attention all along. Emily's breathing was shallow but steady, her skin flushed from the heat, and as a server rushed over with a glass of water, the man stopped him with a quick gesture, instructing him calmly to bring ice and a clean cloth instead, his actions precise, almost practiced, like he had seen this before and knew exactly what mattered most in these moments. The manager finally pushed through the crowd, irritation still lingering on his face as if the situation was an inconvenience rather than an emergency, asking what was going on and why there was a scene in front of paying guests. But the moment his eyes met the man kneeling beside Emily, his expression shifted, confusion replacing annoyance as recognition slowly set in, the kind that made his posture straighten and his voice falter mid-sentence, because the man did not need to raise his voice or introduce himself. His presence alone carried weight, the kind that did not belong to an ordinary guest, and yet he stayed focused on Emily, brushing damp strands of hair from her face as he spoke again, softer now, telling her to stay with him, telling her help was coming. Even though she could barely hear him through the haze, her world drifting between sound and silence, light and shadow, And somewhere in that space, she felt something change, not just in her body but in the air around her. The tension shifting from indifference to urgency, from distance to attention. And as the first hint of shade was brought over her, blocking the harsh sunlight, the man stood slowly, turning his attention to the manager, who now looked far less confident than before, his voice no longer impatient but uncertain, asking if everything was under control. And the answer came not as reassurance, but as a quiet, controlled statement that carried far more impact than shouting ever could. A statement that made the manager's face pale as the realization fully hit him. Because in that moment he understood exactly who he was speaking to, and more importantly, what that meant for everything that had just happened. While around them the crowd shifted uneasily, phones lowering, whispers spreading faster than before, and Emily, still on the edge of consciousness, had no idea that the person who had stepped in for her was not just someone passing by, but someone who had the power to change the rules of this entire place, and was already deciding whether he would. The manager swallowed hard, his confidence slipping as the man's calm gaze stayed fixed on him. Not angry, not loud, just steady in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And for a brief second no one spoke, the only sound coming from the faint splash of water in the pool and the distant hum of conversations that had not yet caught up to what was happening. Here, then the man finally broke the silence, asking in a low, controlled voice how long she had been working in this heat without a break. And the manager hesitated, glancing around as if searching for an answer that would sound better than the truth. But nothing came, because the truth was already written all over the scene in front of them, in the flushed skin, in the exhaustion that had built up long before this moment, in the way the staff avoided eye contact, and the man nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already suspected, before turning his attention back to Emily, who stirred faintly under the shade now covering her, her breathing a little more stable but still fragile. And as he knelt again, his expression softened in a way that contrasted sharply with the tension around him. He spoke to her quietly, telling her she was going to be all right, that she just needed a moment. And for the first time her eyes flickered open just slightly, enough to register that someone was there, someone who was not rushing past her or looking away, someone who actually saw her. And though she could not fully focus, there was something grounding in his presence, something that cut through the dizziness just enough to make her hold on. While nearby the staff scrambled to bring ice and towels, moving faster now under the unspoken pressure that had settled over the area, and the manager, still trying to regain control of the situation, cleared his throat and said they would handle it, that there was no need to escalate things. But the man did not respond immediately. Instead, he stood once more, taking in the entire scene with a single glance, from the uneasy guests to the anxious staff, to the manager who now looked like he was standing on uncertain ground. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet but carried across the space with unmistakable authority, asking if this was how the resort treated its employees during extreme conditions, asking if anyone had thought to check on them before it reached this point. And no one answered, because the question was not really meant to be answered. It was meant to be understood, and that understanding spread quickly, visible in the way people shifted their weight, in the way the manager's composure cracked just a little more. And then the moment changed again, because from across the pool area a member of the executive staff rushed in, his pace quick, his expression alert, clearly having been alerted to the situation. And the instant he saw the man standing there, everything about his demeanor shifted, his posture straightening, his tone turning respectful as he addressed him directly, not as a guest, but as someone far more important. And that was when the realization fully landed for everyone within earshot, because names were not spoken loudly. They did not need to be. The recognition alone was enough. Daniel Whitmore was not just present, he was watching, and more importantly, he was deciding. And as Emily lay there slowly regaining awareness, the entire atmosphere around her transformed from careless routine into something else entirely, something charged with consequence. Something that meant the events of this day were no longer just another incident to be brushed aside, but the beginning of something that would reach far beyond this single moment. The shift in energy was immediate and undeniable as the executive staff member approached Daniel Whitmore with visible urgency, lowering his voice out of respect, while the surrounding employees watched in stunned silence. Because everything about the situation had just escalated beyond their control, and Daniel did not raise his voice or create a scene. He simply asked a question that carried more weight than any accusation. How long had the staff been required to work under these conditions without proper rest or supervision? And the executive hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood exactly what that answer implied. His eyes briefly flicking toward the manager whose earlier confidence had now completely vanished, replaced by a nervous stillness that said more than any explanation could. And Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if confirming a pattern rather than reacting to a single mistake. Then he turned his attention back to Emily, who was beginning to regain more awareness, her breathing steadier now as the shade and cooling cloth started to help, her eyes opening just enough to take in the unfamiliar scene around her, confusion mixing with exhaustion as she tried to understand why so many people were suddenly focused on her, why the same space that had ignored her minutes ago now felt so tense and quiet. And as she shifted slightly, Daniel spoke again, his tone softer, grounding, telling her to take her time, that she was safe, and something in the way he said it made her believe him even without fully understanding why. While nearby, the executive quickly signaled for additional medical assistance, his movements efficient but careful, aware that every second now mattered not just for Emily, but for what this moment represented. And the manager attempted once more to regain some control, stepping forward with forced composure as he insisted that the situation was being handled, that procedures were in place. But his words felt hollow against the reality, unfolding in front of everyone, and Daniel did not interrupt him. He simply listened, his expression unreadable, until the manager finished, and then after a brief pause that stretched longer than anyone expected, Daniel responded with a calm clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, stating that procedures mean nothing if they are not followed when it matters most. And that silence carried further than any raised voice ever could, settling over the crowd like a final verdict that had not yet been fully spoken. And the executive immediately stepped in, acknowledging the concern, promising a full review, his tone careful, measured. But Daniel's focus had already shifted beyond promises, beyond explanations, because this was no longer about a single incident. It was about a system that had allowed it to happen in the first place. And as Emily slowly pushed herself up with assistance, still weak but more aware, she caught fragments of what was being said, enough to realize that something far bigger was unfolding around her, something that had nothing to do with her position or her role, and everything to do with the man who had chosen not to walk past her when everyone else did. And as she looked at him more clearly for the first time, there was a quiet moment of recognition, not of who he was in the world, but of what he had done in this moment. And before she could speak, before she could even fully process what had happened, Daniel made a simple request to the executive that changed the direction of everything that would come next, asking for a complete halt to all poolside operations until every staff member had been accounted for and properly evaluated. And the silence that followed was not confusion anymore. It was realization, because this was no longer just about fixing a mistake. It was about rewriting the rules entirely. The words settled over the entire poolside like a sudden drop in temperature. And for a moment no one moved, because what Daniel had just said did not sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a decision. And decisions like that did not usually come from someone standing in the middle of a crowd unless they had the authority to back it up. And the executive knew it, his hesitation lasting only a fraction of a second before he nodded and immediately began issuing instructions through his radio, his tone sharp and efficient as he called for all operations to pause, for staff to step away from active duties, for supervisors to account for every employee on shift. And the ripple effect was instant. Guests looking around in confusion as service slowed, conversations breaking into whispers as the realization spread that something serious was unfolding, not behind closed doors but right in front of them. And Emily, still seated with assistants, felt the shift before she fully understood it, the sudden quiet replacing the constant movement she had grown used to, the pressure lifting in a way that felt almost unreal, as if the entire environment had paused just long enough for her to finally catch her breath. And she looked up again at Daniel, her voice still weak but steady enough to form a question, asking quietly why he was helping her, a question that hung in the air not as a challenge but as genuine confusion, because in her world people did not stop like this. They did not change everything over one moment. and Daniel met her gaze for a brief second, his expression softening in a way that contrasted with the firm control he had shown just moments earlier. And though he did not answer right away, there was something in his eyes that suggested this was not just about her, not just about what had happened here today. While nearby, the manager stood frozen, watching everything he thought he controlled unravel piece by piece. The staff no longer looking to him for direction, but to the executive, the guests no longer ignoring the workers, but watching closely, as if seeing them for the first time. And the discomfort on his face grew as the implications settled in, because this was no longer a situation he could explain away or minimize. This was being seen, fully and clearly, by the one person whose opinion mattered most. And as the minutes passed, more staff gathered at the edges of the pool area, some confused, some concerned, all of them aware that something significant was happening even if they did not yet know the full reason. And the heat still pressed down from above. But now it felt different, no longer something to be endured silently, but something being acknowledged, addressed, taken seriously. And as medical personnel finally arrived, moving quickly but calmly to assess Emily's condition, Daniel stepped back slightly to give them space, his focus shifting once more to the broader scene, to the employees now being checked, to the systems now being questioned, and it became clear that this moment was not going to end with a simple resolution. It was building towards something larger, something that would reach far beyond this single afternoon. And as Emily was carefully helped to her feet, still unsteady but supported, she glanced back at him one more time, sensing that whatever was happening next was only beginning. And she had somehow become the center of it without ever expecting to be, as Emily was guided carefully toward a shaded seating area by the medical team. The world around her felt slower, quieter, as if the noise of the resort had been turned down just enough for her to finally hear her own thoughts, her heartbeat still uneven but stabilizing with each passing moment. And even though her body felt weak, there was a growing awareness that something far beyond her control had been set in motion, something she did not yet understand but could feel in the way people were moving, in the way conversations had shifted from casual to cautious. And behind her, Daniel remained standing, watching everything unfold with a level of attention that made it clear he was not finished, not even close. His presence now drawing in more than just staff. As senior management began to arrive one by one, each of them carrying the same look of concern mixed with urgency, because news had spread quickly through internal channels, faster than any guest rumor. And they all knew that when Daniel Whitmore chose to stop and observe instead of walk away, it meant something was about to change. And the executive who had first responded continued coordinating with precision, checking staff conditions, ensuring water stations were brought out, instructing supervisors to rotate employees out of the heat, actions that should have already been in place but were now being enforced with immediate seriousness. And the contrast was impossible to ignore, because just an hour ago none of this had existed, and now it was happening all at once, triggered by a single moment that could no longer be dismissed. And Emily, sitting with a cooling pack placed gently in her hands, watched as her co-workers were approached one by one, asked if they were feeling well, told to step aside if they needed rest, their usual hesitation replaced by a quiet acceptance that for once, they were being seen. And that realization alone carried a kind of weight she had never experienced before. While nearby, the manager stood off to the side, no longer issuing commands, no longer in control, his role reduced to watching the consequences of decisions that had once seemed routine. His expression caught somewhere between regret and disbelief, as if he was only now understanding how quickly everything could shift when the right person was paying attention. And Daniel finally moved again, not toward the center of the crowd this time, but toward the edges where staff had gathered, his pace measured, his focus deliberate. And as he spoke quietly with a few of them, asking simple questions about their schedules, their breaks, their workload, the answers came hesitantly at first, then more openly, because something about his approach made it clear he was not asking to check a box. He was asking to understand. And with each response, his expression grew more resolved, more certain, as if a larger picture was forming in his mind, one that extended far beyond this single poolside. And as Emily watched from a distance, still trying to piece together what was happening, she realized that whatever this moment was, it was not ending with her recovery. It was expanding, reaching into parts of the system she had never even thought about. And for the first time since she had started working there, she felt something unfamiliar, not just relief, but the possibility that this place, this routine, this entire experience might not go back to the way it was before, and that thought alone was enough to make her sit a little straighter, despite the exhaustion, because deep down she could sense that the man who had stepped in was not just reacting to what had happened. He was preparing to change what would happen next. The questions Daniel asked did not stop at surface level, and as he moved from one employee to another, a pattern began to reveal itself in ways that could not be ignored. Stories of skipped breaks, of long shifts under direct sunlight, of unspoken pressure to keep going no matter how intense the conditions became. And while none of the staff said it outright at first, the truth settled into the air between every word they chose carefully, because they all understood what had been expected of them, and more importantly, what had not been given in return. And Daniel listened without interrupting, without reacting too quickly, absorbing every detail with a focus that made it clear he was not just hearing them. He was building something from what they shared, and across the poolside the executive staff had already begun adjusting operations beyond the immediate pause, setting up additional shaded areas, arranging scheduled rotations, bringing out coolers filled with water and electrolyte drinks, actions that felt almost overdue as they unfolded in real time. And for the first time, the employees were not rushing to meet demands. They were being guided to step back, to rest, to check in with themselves. And the shift was almost disorienting, because it contrasted so sharply with everything that had come before. While Emily remained seated, her strength slowly returning, watching as co-workers who had once kept their heads down now spoke openly. When asked, their voices still cautious but carrying a quiet sense of relief. And as she followed Daniel's movement through the area, she noticed something that stood out even more than his authority. It was the way he paid attention to details others overlooked, the way he noticed the smallest signs of fatigue, the way he paused long enough for people to feel heard. And it created a ripple effect that extended beyond just the staff, because even the guests who had once been detached now watched with a different kind of awareness, their conversations quieter, their expressions more thoughtful, as if they were beginning to see the environment differently too. And as the situation stabilized further, the executive returned to Daniel's side with an update, explaining the steps already taken, outlining the immediate changes being implemented, his tone respectful but also slightly uncertain, as if waiting for confirmation that it was enough. But Daniel's response was not immediate approval. Instead, he asked one more question, one that shifted the focus entirely, asking how long these conditions had been allowed to continue before today. And the executive paused, the answer clearly not something that could be easily simplified. And in that pause the reality became clear. This was not a one-day issue. It was something that had been building over time, something that had gone unnoticed or unaddressed until it could no longer be ignored. And Daniel nodded once more, his expression settling into a quiet determination that carried more weight than anything he had said so far. Because now it was not just about correcting the present, it was about confronting the past. And as Emily listened from where she sat, her thoughts beginning to sharpen as the dizziness faded, she realized that this moment was no longer just about what had happened to her. It had become something larger, something that was exposing the hidden structure behind everything she had experienced since the day she started working there. And as that realization settled in, she understood that whatever came next would not simply fix a problem. It would redefine the entire system she had been a part of. And Daniel Whitmore was the one deciding how that change would unfold. The answer the executive could not fully give lingered in the air, and Daniel did not push him to fill the silence, because the silence itself had already revealed everything that needed to be understood. And for a brief moment, he looked out across the poolside again, not just at the staff or the management, but at the entire environment, the polished image of luxury that had quietly depended on effort no one had truly acknowledged until now. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, not just controlled but decisive, as if the conclusion had already formed long before this moment and was now simply being put into motion. He instructed the executive to prepare a full internal review not limited to this location but across all properties under his ownership, to examine policies, enforcement, and the actual lived experience of employees rather than what reports claimed. And the executive nodded immediately, understanding that this was no longer a localized response, but a company-wide directive, something that would extend far beyond what anyone standing there had expected when the day began. And as those instructions were set in motion, Daniel's attention returned once more to Emily, who was now sitting upright, her strength gradually returning as the medical team confirmed she was stable, her breathing even, her awareness fully back. And though she still felt the lingering effects of exhaustion, there was a clarity in her expression now, a quiet awareness that she had become part of something significant, something she never intended but could not ignore. And when Daniel approached her again, the surrounding noise seemed to fade just slightly, not completely silent, but softened enough for the moment to feel separate from everything else happening around them. And he asked her a simple question, how long she had been working without a proper break. And this time she answered without hesitation, her voice steady despite everything, explaining the shifts, the expectations, the unspoken understanding that stopping was not really an option. And as she spoke, there was no accusation in her tone, just honesty, the kind that comes from someone who had accepted a situation because she believed she had no choice. And Daniel listened closely, his expression unchanged but his focus absolute. And when she finished, there was a brief pause, not uncomfortable but meaningful, because what had just been said did not require interpretation, it required action, and that was exactly what he intended to take. While nearby, the manager remained at a distance, no longer attempting to speak, fully aware that whatever control he once had was gone, replaced by a reality he could not influence anymore. And the rest of the staff watched quietly, sensing that this conversation mattered, that it was not just about Emily's experience, but about all of theirs. And as Daniel finally responded, his voice was calm, but carried a certainty that left no room for doubt. He told her that what happened today should not have happened. Not here, not anywhere under his responsibility, and that it would not be allowed to happen again. And those words settled differently than anything else spoken that day, because they were not reactive, they were intentional, forward-looking. And as Emily held his gaze for a moment, she realized that this was not just a promise made in the heat of a situation, it was a commitment backed by the power to follow through. And as the afternoon continued to unfold around them, the sense of something changing became undeniable, not just in policy or procedure, but in awareness itself, as if a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. And for everyone present, whether they fully understood it yet or not, this moment had already begun to reshape what would come. Next, the afternoon did not return to normal, and that was the first sign that something real had shifted, because even as operations slowly resumed in a controlled and adjusted way, nothing felt the same as before, the laughter more restrained, the staff more visible, the management more present in ways that had not existed just hours earlier. And Emily, now fully conscious and able to stand on her own with only slight support, looked around with a sense of disbelief that had not yet fully settled into understanding, because what had started as another exhausting shift had turned into something she could never have expected, something that had reached far beyond her own experience and touched every part of the environment around her. And as the medical team finished their assessment and confirmed she would be all right with rest and proper hydration, she felt a quiet wave of relief, not just for herself, but for what had changed in that moment. And when Daniel approached her one final time before stepping away, there was no audience around them, no tension left in the air, just a calm space that felt separate from everything else. And he told her that she should take the rest of the day off, that her well-being mattered more than any shift or schedule. And for a second she did not respond, not because she did not understand, but because she was not used to hearing something like that said so directly. And when she finally nodded, there was a quiet gratitude in her expression that did not need to be spoken out loud, because the moment had already said enough. And as he turned to leave, the executive moved quickly to follow, already discussing next steps, timelines, and immediate policy changes that would be implemented not just here, but across every location. Their voices low but purposeful, carrying the momentum of decisions that would not be delayed. While behind them, the manager remained still, no longer part of the conversation, no longer part of the direction things were heading. And for the staff who watched from a distance, there was a shared understanding forming, something unspoken but powerful, that what had happened today was not going to fade into routine memory. It was going to stay, it was going to matter, and Emily, as she was guided away from the poolside toward a cooler, quieter area, took one last look back at the place where everything had changed, the same space that had once felt overwhelming now carrying a different meaning entirely. And though she did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, whether it would mean new opportunities, new expectations, or something she could not yet imagine, she knew one thing with certainty. The version of this place she had known before no longer existed, and somewhere beyond that realization was a question that had not yet been answered, not fully, not completely, a question about why Daniel Whitmore had chosen to stop, why this moment had mattered to him in a way that went deeper than responsibility. And as the days slowly moved forward, that question lingered, waiting, because the answer to it would reveal a story far more personal than anyone there could have guessed, a story that had only just begun to surface.